Alrighty, lads. I've decided to finally start a campaign diary to chronicle the adventures of my party, partly just to keep notes for myself and to just have a record on hand. To come back and think about, find out what I thought about my campaign as it was going on. So far, we've had 3 sessions, so we got a little bit of catching up to do. Hopefully, in the future, I'll try to make one entry per session that comes out. We'll see whether or not I can keep up with that. So, this campaign, I had hopes of running it in a West Marches style type campaign. I have very high hopes of having hopefully like upwards of 40 players in my campaign. Um, Unfortunately, that has not exactly been the case. I have been so lucky as to at least get 3 players on board. Hopefully, I will get more players as we go on. So, a little bit of background for the campaign. Little more old school. I'm using my homebrew rules system, so it's like mostly recognizable as 5e. I do quite like that 5e bounded accuracy. Lots of elements from Warhammer being taken. I absolutely love all those giant tables in Warhammer and how you can discover stuff from like that feeling of like, oh my god, that's what happens when you roll a 1 on this table. I love lingering injuries, critical hits, all those tables, arcane miscasts, and from the newest version of Warhammer, the fourth edition, the Wrath of the Gods tables for the blessings of divine casters. I think all that stuff is great, so I just jammed it into 5e as best as I could. Um, so far, no one has died, although it's a relatively more lethal, or at least I had intended it to be on the more lethal side of campaigns. As for the campaign and setting itself, it is in a realm that is called Igolia, the Kingdom of Igolia. It's vaguely influenced by sort of French mythology, a little bit of Arthurian knights, some inspiration taken from Bretonia. My ideal goal with this campaign was to start with relatively simple dungeon crawls and standard adventuring procedure and quests, and eventually to move on to once the players like have accumulated enough wealth to start buying property, forts, hopefully eventually kingdoms, and then get involved with local politics, all that jazz. So, starting off with our first session, actually, I should also note that I am running this entirely in real time. So, for each day that passes in real life, 1 day passes in the game. And the game covers no more than like a week's worth of time, like going into a week into the future. So, and there's extended long rests and all that, so there's none of this getting all your HP back in 24 hours. If you get hurt and injured, it's going to take some time for you to recuperate. Okay, so getting off into the campaign, our first session, this was more of a session zero. It was effectively only like an hour long of gameplay because they both just made their characters. We have Cletus, a dwarf of Clan Gilmore. Cletus, I tend to try to avoid silliness. I never want to discourage or disparage any like creative choices my players ever make. So if they come up with something, then I always lean towards being supportive of that choice and trying to come up with a reason to have it work. So Cletus as a dwarf name. This actually got me thinking. I looked into the origin of Cletus, and it's apparently like a Greco-Roman type name, and there are actually like high positioned people in ancient Greece, like Alexander the Great's generals, and I believe like one of the first popes actually was named or like had Cletus like in their name as a part of it, which is quite funny. And I looked up how did Cletus become like a redneck name, and apparently it's from a character in the show Dukes of Hazzard. Apparently, the sheriff, his name is Cletus, And like I don't know how that became the just like sort of generic redneck name. Like I'm gonna assume has something to do with The Simpsons. I don't know whether how like if The Simpsons just like came up with that and then it just stuck, or if they got that from something else. I don't know, but it was actually quite interesting. So you have Cletus Gilmore, very, he's a dwarf rogue. Rogues, something that I think back in classical D&D, you did actually see more dwarf rogues when they were like trap disarmers, and I'm particularly thinking in Dark Alliance 2 with one of the like generic dwarf rogue characters that you play, and he like throws bombs and stuff at people. We also have Adrian Queenstone, a little bit of like a charlatan character. He's a half elf bard, actually. I think he's going for the sort of college, like very swordsman type, getting into duels. I'm thinking that like one episode of Firefly when the Captain Reynolds gets in the duel with that guy. I imagine lots of that kind of stuff is what he's going for. So, I'm going to try to set up some more of those swordsman duels. Cletus, I should say, he is a noble. So he is of a once proud clan of dwarves that have uh, certainly, they're nowhere near the status of like the great clans of the dwarves, very much so a minor clan. He's just they don't even have their own hold, their own fortress. They are currently like refugees living inside another of one of the holds of the Great Dwarf clans. So he's trying to raise his status among his people, trying to get gold to fund a new hold and all that stuff. So I should also okay. So for this next part, for the character creation in my sort of system, I've combined sort of Xanathar's "This Is Your Life" section with Travelers like life events and like your career before you went out. Um, One of the results, Adrian Queenstone had rescued a gray orc slave by the name of Gruz, and Gruz has since offered to accompany them and to help them on their adventures. So in this first session, they had both met up. Adrian's motivation to go out to particularly this realm and begin adventuring is that his wife, an elf, the Lady Arwen, has she is like an archaeologist type that is in this realm currently searching for an artifact, and she has since like lost all communication, gone cold, um, or like the track has gone cold. So she is like effectively disappeared. Adrian is trying to find her. The last thing, or that he knows the artifact, the Orison Oriflame, an ancient elven artifact that she's trying to recover. He happened across Cletus, who happened to have part of a treasure map to this artifact. So that's his best clue in his pursuit of finding his wife. So on the road, they were going to this town. This town was the last location that the map had revealed. On their way to this town, they encountered some bandits, some highwaymen. Um, they were not aware of this, but they have a clue in the fact that they saw a tattoo on one of the bandits. They weren't. Neither of them were familiar with this group, but they are of a group, the Roadhounds, a sort of infamous highwayman bandit group that is, terrorizing these roads and setting up illegal tolls and such. And One of these tolls stopped Adrian and Cletus. Fortunately for them, Gruz happened to be out in the prairie. I've decided that the main biome for this land are long grass prairies. So, like, the grass just everywhere is like 3 to 6 feet high. So, if you're not like directly on a road, there's like always a place to hide. Kind of like if it were just Pokemon tall grass just everywhere. Um, so yeah, Cletus hopped out of this grass and started killing these bandits that were trying to rob Cletus and Adrian. Afterwards, they successfully got to town safely. I gave them both an opportunity to pursue some downtime. I can't remember exactly what Adrian did. Uh, I think he might have attempted something and had just failed his check to get any sort of meaningful result from his downtime activity. Cletus had successfully robbed a prosperous merchant and made a profit of 75 gold, which, that's something I had sort of like worried about looking back on downtime activities that I think I might have to change because right now the downtime activities are nearly identically just ripped from Xanathar. But when players can relatively easily just make like 50 to 100 gold in just a week of just like relatively low stakes, low risk work, the incentive to go out to extremely dangerous dungeons and possibly die and all that stuff is just way, way lower to have any like incentive to go there. So I think I'm going to do some sort of combination of just generally lowering the amounts of money you make from downtime activities, possibly increase the risk, make it, you know, possible that you can suffer some long term consequences from failing your, the more risky of downtime activities. Alternatively, I'm also just gonna have to like boost the amount of gold and treasure that I have in my dungeons. I think generally the easiest way to do that is just by throwing in like a magic item of any kind, because magic items are just by themselves going to be worth like hundreds, likely thousands of gold, and it's just gonna acquiring a magic item through any other means is just going to be way way harder than just finding it in a dungeon. So Gruz decided to not actually go inside the city or into the town of Borzul. He's just been hiding out a few miles away. Okay, so that was the first session. Then some time passed, and we are at the second session. If this was like a session 0, this first one where I didn't really have much planned. The first session, they had a little bit more to go off of. So Cletus is visited by the ghost of his brother Cletok. This was another thing that Cletus had rolled for in his like "This Is Your Life" background events. His brother died, so I decided his brother came out, and he's a ghost, dwarven ancestor spirit ghost. He tells his brother that his body was interred into the wrong tomb and that he needs to be rightfully interred into or properly interred into a dwarven hall of the ancestors. Right, this is what Adrian had done. So Cletus had done his activity on the first week. Adrian did his activity at the beginning of the second session, and he did gambling, and he did win. He made a small profit. I went with 3 Dragon Ante just because you gotta have your unique gambling game for your D&D setting. Definitely, I'm gonna have to come up with my own because I can't just steal Forgotten Realms or wherever 3 Dragon Ante is technically from. But hopefully, ideally, I can like somehow make a real game out of playing cards. It's probably gonna take a decent amount of effort. Probably be more effort than it's worth, but whatever. So he played against this another dwarf, a dwarf of the Stonebeard clan. They are one of the great clans of the dwarves, but this guy is just a real mean slaver type. His full name, Marquis Stonebeard, supposed to be a play on like Marquis de Sade. He's Marquis. Okay, but yeah, he's really just really cruel. He absolutely hates goblins. He's just extremely sadistic. He is, he just like tortures them for fun, and his body is like adorned in goblin necklaces, and he's got goblin skulls on his pauldrons. His weapon, he wields a two-handed whip that is just made out of like a steel spine, and he's just running around smashing people with that. Um, so this is the guy that Adrian gambles against. So they find out about this tomb that Kleetok was wrongfully interred into, which is apparently an ancient human burial ground, known as the burial place of Chief Gilliard of the Wolf Clan of long, 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 long ago, like before, like, just at the very early stages of human civilization and all that jazz. So they go to this burial barn. They decide to. So they also discover that Gruz has a twin brother by the name of Screws, who also happens to have been taken as a slave by some inhabitants of this burial mound. So Gruz asks for one last favor from Adrian and offers basically his eternal servitude, his eternal loyalty, should Adrian help him on this matter, um, rescuing his brother. So Adrian tries to go for a sort of a sneaky play. This I was not expecting, but I was quite happy with the result. So they had Adrian had told Marquide. Marquide happened to be looking for additional slaves. I almost forgot. Adrian, he went into the tavern room that Marquide was staying in, and he had discovered that Marquide in one of his chests has a paper, like a sheet of parchment that was a written out contract between Marquide and one of the, you know, it's a separate kingdom is known as the accursed Tsardom of Tyrion. It's and it's the origin place of the like greatest evil the humans have ever faced. And like so since then it's really just been a period of recovery from that stigma that they have. Um, but from this contract, Marquis does a deal to bring like many slaves from Igolia up north to Tyrion. And he's being offered like a large sum of gold to sell slaves up there. So Marquis is the slaver that Adrian had freed Gruz from. And Marquis had returned to this town and has basically put a bounty out for Gruz for this orc slave, and it said like I will pay anyone handsomely should they like help return this this prisoner to me. And Adrian basically says like, well, I have a lead. I think there may be someone of that description in this burial tomb taken by these goblins. So they go to the burial tomb. They take Marquis because they're like, hey, yeah, your slave is over here. So Marquis goes in first, and Marquis, he's no chump. He is like a champion of his people. He is like one of the greatest fighters among the Stonebeards to have existed. So I got in this funny little predicament where we went to the dungeon, and they basically had just told Marquis to go first and to do everything. Marquis is not really one to be cowardly or refuse to go first. He's quite brazen and arrogant. So I didn't see any reason for him to not go first. And what this has sort of resulted in is both of the PCs just like peeking around every single corner as they send Marquis in first. He just runs in there. He just obliterates all the rats at the entrance. He goes down. They find some clay pots that they smash with spiders in them, and Marquis just slaughters them. Then they decide to split up down two passageways at the bottom of the dungeon. That reminds me, I should say this Chief of Gilliard. This is like a one-page dungeon I just stole off the internet. So it's definitely out there somewhere if you want to find it. So yeah, so they split up. Marquis is just being an absolute savage and just obliterating everything on his half of the dungeon that they go into. The Adrian and Cletus go down the other half. They find some drunk goblins that they just slaughter without any problem. So yeah, they run through this dungeon. They kill the goblins. Marquis kills like a goblin witch doctor, and he has like this dark elf with him. The players never interacted with or even saw. He just darknessed and then disappeared. Okay. So in that room with the 5 drunk goblins, the players find one goblin tied up. This is the old leader. Apparently, the dark elf that had also just recently fled had taken his position and then has taken that old goblin as his prisoner. There was also a tied up orc, Screws, the twin brother of Gruz. Okay, so yeah, the players took this tied up goblin that had Screws as a prisoner. They went down into the basement cellar level. They went down deeper into the dungeon. They had found and they had found in an altar room down there. They had found the tied up Screws. So Marquis went through this altar or went into this altar room to take his prisoner, and Adrian had thrown a dagger. He got a nat 20 to hit this skull with gems in it, and so when this skull broke, all these spectral wolves just popped out of the walls and started attacking. Everyone ran away up to the upper floor, and they had so yeah. At this point, Marquis had Gruz. I'm sorry, Marquis had Screws. I believe Adrian and Cletus's uh, intention at this point was now to sort of like ambush and like just betray Marquis, but he just seemed to be too like I should. So the Stonebeards in particular have a their entire culture is entrenched in this like slave taking and slave trading thing that they get into, and they have these like massive gorgets they wear around their necks because they're constantly under threat of like being assassinated by the slaves they've captured. So like just a decent amount of their culture is like founded around the idea of like avoiding getting backstabbed and assassinated by the slaves you've captured, especially because they don't just capture any chump as a slave. They capture like lizard folk and orcs and like relatively strong, capable uh creatures. Yes, so Cletus tried to sneak a knife to Screws, uh, so that Screws could later free himself. But when they did this, Cletus had rolled a natural one and just absolutely blundered his attempt to sneak a knife to Screws. At this point, Marquis catches them. He doesn't know what's going on. He's just confused at this point. Um, he thinks, yeah, he considers just like starting a fight and killing both of them, but he's not willing to risk his life to get into a 2v1 duel against these guys and possibly end up getting killed, especially if they do free Screws and then turn it into a 3-on-1. So Marquis just takes Screws and then gets out of there. So at this point, Cletus and Adrian take the tied up orc. Not so at this point, Adrian and Cletus take the tied up goblin, the Hogor horse thief that they had found that the town had 100 gold contract for, like a bounty for. So they take them back to town and take him to the captain of the guard, and they get their reward. But the reason Cletus went in there was to rescue his brother's body, which he had, failed to do. But yeah, that was that for that session. They just ended up going back and resting. And then that brings us to the session the third. So this is where we are introduced to our third newest character, a orc by the name of Grumdil, and half orc, actually, I should specify. Grumdil is a half orc, the barbarian, outlander. This character creation we kind of rushed because we wanted to get the session started. So he's just at this point very, very like basic core, just what you would expect from a half orc barbarian. Um, so Grumdil. Okay, yeah, at the end of the last session, Gruz had decided to go and leave and to track down his twin brother with and Marquide, um, and rescue him and all that. And he had basically recommended Gruz happened to know Grumdil from something in the past and had uh, sort of recommended him as a bodyguard to Adrian until Gruz could return. So they're introduced to Grumdil. So at this point, Adrian he does the pit fighting downtime, and we've sort of flavored it as less about pit fighting and more of like a antagonizing nobles and like getting in sword duels with them for money. Um, this is really the thing that made me realize that money from downtime is just way too good because you get 3 wins, you get 100 gold. Rules is written, which is not particularly difficult. Like you got to make some skill checks, but like even if you don't get 3 wins, you only would get a single win, or even if you get 2 wins. But 2 wins is like pretty average, especially because like you're gonna have, I think on average, a better bonus than because the average difficulty I think is 16. So okay, but yeah, like if you can safely assume you'll win 2 each time, which is not too outside of the realm of possibility for a first level character. You can just make 50 gold every single week with like effectively no downside, or with only a very small chance of downside. Um, but anyway, so Grumdil is there, and he's sort of acting as Adrian's second in the duel. Should like Adrian fall or whatever. So they all meet up. They decide to go back to the burial mound. They go all the way deep inside. Um, they find the tomb of the chief Gilliard, Adrian and Cletus. Well, they find Cletok as one of the bodies in like this like in one of the like many graves surrounding the tomb, uh, and Cletok's spirit temporarily possesses his skeleton dwarf body and hops up and helps them fight skeletons and stuff. Um, Grumdil amazingly is able to tank 3 critical hits from the Sword of Gilliard, which was pretty impressive. That's just barbarian rage for you, I guess, taking half damage from everything. So they defeat Gilliard, and they take his magical sword. It is a cursed +1 long sword that basically Grumdil is the only one who can wield it. He's the only one proficient in it, so he takes it. So he takes the +1 cursed sword, which basically I've introduced a trauma mechanic, sort of as like the sort of like Warhammer Insanity, sort of like going mad and all that jazz. So basically, whenever he would gain a trauma point, he gains an additional trauma point as well. So we'll see whether or not he goes mad very quickly. So they take the body of Kleetok and they get out of there safely after defeating him. They loot the tomb, obviously. I know for their next session, they have since discovered that Marquide is heading to a dwarven hold. And so they plan on going to that dwarven hold with Kleetok's body to to get him properly interred into a Hall of the Ancestors. Um, so that's where we're set for the setup for session 4. Nothing utterly crazy has happened so far. The first couple of sessions are always just everyone's sort of trying to figure out what their characters deal with and what direction they want to go in. But I think it's a solid start. At the end of this third session, Cletus and Adrian got to level 2, and so that's it for my session recap. Hopefully, session 4 is a good one.